All right, so I think we'll get started. Um, Welcome, everyone. My name is Kayla Valdez. I'm the current National President for Women in Bio. I'd like to welcome everyone to the February National Webinar, which has been developed by the National Diversity and Inclusion Resource Group for Women in Bio. And I am going to share my screen. If I could get access to that. I think you should be able to see that right now. All right, before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit more information for those that maybe are new to WIB about our organization before I turn it over to our speakers for today. So Women in Bio was founded in 2002. It's a professional organization dedicated to advancing the careers, promoting leadership opportunities, and fostering entrepreneurship for all women in the life sciences. As I mentioned, today's webinar was developed by the Diversity and Inclusion Resource Group. This group was founded in mid-2020 to build upon WIB's current efforts to improve and champion inclusivity across the life sciences. This is a group of dedicated volunteer leaders who act as resources and provide guidance to both the national and chapter leadership teams to ensure WIB's activities continue to be a catalyst for fostering inclusive and equitable environments for all members, supporters, and partners for the organization. WIB's initiatives also aim to support your career journey from the classroom to the boardroom, starting off with young women in bio for middle school and high school age girls. We continue our support through our mentor, advisor, peers, and sponsorship or MAPS programming throughout your early to mid-career, and then round you out in the C-suite through our Executive Women in Bio initiatives, including our flagship Boardroom Ready program. And we hope that you come and become a mentor and cycle all the way through with us throughout your career. For today's event, I'd like to thank our event sponsor, PNC Bank. Without PNC's contribution, this event would not have been possible. And WIB thanks PNC for championing our diversity and inclusion efforts. I'd also like to give a shout out and express my sincere gratitude for our national sponsors, in particular BMS. Thank you all for your generous support. And with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Alana Kaplan-Munoz. Alana will be introducing the rest of the speakers, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background about Alana. She is a principal at Metaplan. She's worked with a broad range of Metaplan clients to generate alignment, buy-in, and consensus using the Metaplan methodology to generate collective insights and align strategies in organization. Alana's focus are in strategic and brand planning, launch and competitive readiness, and cross-functional and leadership team alignment. She supports senior leadership and cross-functional teams with a focus on consensus-based decision-making. Her clients value her ability to lead teams to strategic directions and decisions by synthesizing insights and driving to collective action. Prior to joining Metaplan in 2003, Alana worked in marketing with consumer packaged good companies, including Nabisco and Gerber, with a focus on new products. Alana has also worked in the technology arena as an investment banker with Broadview Associates and as a member of the management team at IP Highway. Alana holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a Bachelor's of Arts from Yale. And she lives in New Jersey with her husband and 2 daughters. So Alana, with that, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Kayla. I couldn't have written that better myself. I wanted to take a moment to introduce our panelists. We have an all-star lineup. As you saw in the promo, and we're really excited about our session today. I'm going to introduce each of our esteemed speakers and panelists, and then ask you to just share a few more words about your role or a story around this topic. Let's start with our featured speaker. Thalia Mingo is the global lead for the BristolMyers Squibb Network of Women. Thalia, welcome.
Thank you, Alana. Hi, everyone. As it says, I'm Thalia Mingo, the global lead for the BristolMyers Squibb Network of Women, or as we refer to it, B-Now. I have been with Bristol-Myers for 23 years and have had roles of increasing responsibility over that time. I started in sales and progressively moved through our learning and training department into marketing roles, and then through commercialization. Just recently returned to the U.S. from an expat assignment, and now sitting as the global lead for within our D&I organization, but also sitting across the enterprise as the representative for driving the advancement and development of women within BMS. So I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Next, we have Alicia Hemphill. She is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Consulting at L'Oreal Stat and Matrix. Alicia?
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending upon where you are. My name is Alicia Hemphill, and I have been with L'Oreal Stat and Matrix for about a couple of years. Started out my career at Abbott Laboratories as a regulatory affairs specialist. Was able to increase my responsibilities into this role by moving into different companies and relocating around the country. Spent some time at W. Gore & Associates, working for new product development there, and then came back to Texas, where I originally started as a director of regulatory affairs, and was able to then move into L'Oreal Stat and Matrix, where I could say in most all of my areas of my career, I've really been keenly involved and intentional about advocating for women and minorities, and has very much been involved in all aspects, from organizational development, from working with networks to even working with government organizations within cities, and bringing together interesting parties around the state in order to promote minority and inclusion. And so presently, I'm continuing that activity with L'Oreal Stat and Matrix, and we're moving very rapidly into diverse D&I and a diverse work group. And so I'm very pleased with that, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you. And we have Dr. Alexandra Resnick, who's given me permission to call her Allie. She's an assistant professor at Chatham University. Allie?
Thanks, Alana, and hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be here today. I am an assistant professor of not biology, but women's and gender studies, literature and cultural studies. And so my journey as a graduate student studying at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh really rejuvenated me to do a lot of work. Duquesne is a predominantly white institution located in a Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. So working with, from the jump of, attending Duquesne, I had the opportunity to work with students on anti-racism initiatives and, work within that institution to think through authentic ways of working with the community and also serving the diverse body of students that attend Duquesne. I'm currently an assistant professor at Chatham University. In that role, I've done, I'm going to say, two different things. So I do workshops with nonprofit and for-profit organizations. Leadership reaches out to me to say, we're interested in helping our employees advocate for disenfranchised groups, and also specifically with energy towards anti-racism. So I do workshops that aren't just a one-off, and they include, individuals learning and reflecting, having one-on-one conversations with people in their company, and then we do these group workshops where we actually practice what does anti-racism look like in the company, in the workplace, and how could we tailor specifically making hiring practices equitable, thinking through, I push the people who do the workshops and my students to think through their own personal identities in order to create the most equitable solutions. possible. At my institution, collectively, we're doing a lot of really exciting initiatives, including a hiring advocacy program where just this year we're starting to, train people at all different levels of the institution to be able to intentionally participate in hiring practices, hiring decisions. And I've also been helping with, we have developed white accountability groups with people across the institution, with faculty and staff, to make sure that we're making our institution as inclusive and equitable as possible. I will stop talking at this point.
Thank you. That's so helpful, everyone. And if I pick up on some of the words that you use, Allie, dialogue, awareness, action, I hope we'll be talking about all of those topics today. They're all key to this. And I think they fit with what all of you in the audience mentioned in our word cloud. And you even talked about pushing a little bit, right? And that was a sense I saw intention in some of these ideas, and maybe there's a need to push at times to be successful. So that's really what we want to hear about today. What are some of the best practices to foster advocacy in our organizations? What are some of the challenges? How did we overcome them? And then walk away with something actionable that each of us can do when we leave the session. And there's no one better to talk about best practices than Thalia Mingo. Thalia, you mentioned you're leading the Be Now network, and I know BMS has a host of networks, and we'd love to hear a little bit about how that all works and what are some best practices at BMS.
Thank you, Alana, for that question. So you're absolutely right. I am one of 8 dimensions of diversity that Bristol-Myers Squibb has focused on in its diversity and inclusion efforts. They're intentional. BMS is intentional as an organization. We are intentional as an organization in driving diversity and inclusion so that it impacts our business. And I think there's studies that have shown that when you encourage every voice, then you're getting the best business outcomes. So what Bristol-Myers has done is developed a model a little different from other models as it relates to what we refer to as employee resource groups. We actually call them people and business resource groups. And the difference is I have a business plan that is tied to the company's business goals. I have outcomes that we have to deliver through Be Now. And of course, it includes increasing gender representation at senior levels within the company, making sure that women are being developed and advanced. And each of the other 7 dimensions of diversity have their own specific business plans as it relates to what's important to their communities. Okay.
Thank you. And what are some of the other groups, Thalia, that exist at BMS?
I can name them all if you'd like me to.
That would be great.
Now. So there's the Pan-Asian Network for our Asian and South Asia colleagues. There is OLA, the Organization for Latino Achievement. There's Pride Alliance. I don't think I need to explain that one. There's BOLD, which is the Black Organization for Leadership Development. And there's DAWN for our Differently Abled Workers Networks for those who might have to work a little differently because of physical limitations. And VCN, our Veterans Community Network. Okay.
That's a very extensive group of networks. Were you there when that started? And do you have a sense of what drove BMS initially to have that intention?
So, as we look at the landscape of what we are doing, the mission of Bristol-Myers Squibb is to bring innovative medicines to our patients. And, in order to do that and to encourage the voices, we have to have employees that are representative of the patients we're serving. So I think you have to be intentional about listening to who you're trying to serve and then making sure that that's represented within the company. So I think that was one of the key drivers. But as we look at the gender diversity and we look at women, when you really step back and look at the statistics, 80% of the household decisions on healthcare are made by women. So, it's really imperative to have that voice at the table, have that voice being shared across the decisions that are being made and to influence it. And let's face it, and this is no disparaging on men, but it's a written statistic that when companies have women at their C-suite levels as executives sharing in the development of the strategy for the organization, the business outcomes are greater. So I would say it's solely a great business decision to take the stance that we have taken.
And has there been any anecdotal or data yet to signify that that's coming to life, that it's truly helping a business outcome? That sounds hard to quantify.
That's always the question that we get. And the short answer is yes, but you have to take it both as quantifiable and qualitative in looking at it. You cannot look at one in a silo. You have to look at both buckets of data too. And you also look at trends. Just look at what we're living with right now, right? So you need definitely diverse voices at the table to help us navigate through this very uncertain time. That in and of itself is proof that we're doing the right thing.
Thank you. And I wanted to mention, by the way, we have time for questions at the end. So I should say that to the extent that you can hold the questions from the chat so we don't lose them later, please know that we'll have time to come back to that. Thalia, can you tell us a bit about some of the programs that have been really successful at BMS, but maybe also about some of the challenges that you faced in leading the Be Now network?
So I would honestly say, let me start with the challenges, because I think that's the easy part, right? I would say the biggest challenge that I have faced since taking over as Be Now lead was COVID-19, the pandemic. I was announced to the organization as the lead in, I would say, close to the end of February. And 3 weeks later, we were quarantining and shutting down for the pandemic. So everything that we know, that I knew of, and what I had planned to do as I took the reins, I had to throw out and totally regroup and pivot and figure out how to do things differently. That was my biggest challenge. I think the opportunities that this provided, though, was for us to slow down and really look at what we were doing and figuring out how we could make a different type of impact. And of course, I, like everyone else, we thought, oh, we'll be back in April. Oh, we'll be back in June. That bar kept moving. And as the bar continued to move, we started to realize that this was a more serious challenge than what we had anticipated. The stress, the burnout that everyone is feeling, the unpredictability of the situation in and of itself was making people just really tired. So our focus became, how do we address that and encourage our colleagues and our members within Be Now to be a little more resilient? So it gave us time to really step back and look at that. So that was an opportunity. What it also showed us as a leadership team within Be Now, because we cannot move this this alone, is really looking at how do we do this and sustain it as a best practice going forward. We've made great strides with women in leadership positions, not just in BMS, but around the world. But this pandemic has really heightened the risk of us losing that ground. And so what we're focusing on now with conversations, not just within BMS, with many of our partner organizations, is how do we not let that happen? How do we continue moving forward and keeping women and supporting them in the workplace?
Excellent. And in terms of language, we open this session with the question on what advocacy means to each of us. How do you define advocacy from where you sit?
Oh my goodness. So advocacy, in this chair that I sit in, I heard you put that in there, so that's a very different lens, but I'll share it. It means, it's a verb to me, for one thing. It is a verb. It is publicly, I can't say, doing it hidden, but publicly supporting a cause or a movement, putting your own personal brand and equity behind it to see it move. That is advocacy to me.
Thank you. And we talked a little bit in our planning about advocacy, mentorship, sponsorship. You're part of a big organization, so you probably have a bit of all of this. Can you help the rest of us understand what some of the differences are between those terms?
Absolutely. So I shared my own personal definition of advocacy. Let me start with mentorship, because as I look at them, I think of them in degrees, right, or steps. So mentorship to me is probably what I would define as that relationship that might be short-term. It's specific in nature in that it's helping an individual. It's a relationship between two individuals, one possibly a little more knowledgeable or experienced, and helping the second individual navigate through a situation, a project, navigate a culture. But it's usually a very defined period of time in that they're helping. And it could actually be a bidirectional relationship as well. Sponsorship is, again, I'm going to go back to the words of equity and branding of a senior leader. And the difference with sponsorship, and this one can be a little tricky, is that you might not know it exists. You might not know that you actually have someone who's sponsoring you. A lot of times they will tell you, but at the end of the day, you don't really see how they're navigating on your behalf. There's usually that hidden effort that you don't see, but at the same time, this person is using their own equity to help advance you through the organization. Does that help?
It does help.
Okay.
I suspect there might be people out there who might be concerned about losing some of that equity, maybe taking that risk to support someone else. How would you handle, what would you say to address their objections or hesitation?
So, you know, this is actually a big topic of conversation in a lot of our meetings and a lot of conversations with our external partners. And, you know, this also is something that we talk about a lot as it relates to women of color and female talent of color. I don't know if I want to take the risk. I don't know if I'll, you know, and those are words that I would challenge and say, listen, there's no unknown. That's where diversity and inclusion really step up, and you have to be able to say, I'm going to advocate publicly on behalf of this person because I believe. The other thing that this starts to highlight for me when I hear those words is, what's the bias? What's the bias that you might be walking under that you're not aware of? And it's not intentional, that's holding you from supporting this person. So that's where there's an opportunity to really, and I'm going to throw out another word here, is to truly develop an allyship and really understand, you know, what is it, and have those difficult conversations to move beyond the limitation of I don't know if I want to take the risk.
And if I look at it from the other side of the coin for people in the audience, how can we identify an appropriate advocate, someone who might be able to advocate for us and sort of spot them?
You know, listening is one of the keys that I'm learning myself as I take this journey, is really listening to how someone speaks and then watching their actions. It's great to have all of the rhetoric and have the words, but do your actions actually match what you're saying? So identifying an advocate should be very easy. It's that person who you see that will publicly state, I support X, I believe in X, and then their actions actually mirror what they're saying.
I see, thank you. And I wanted to pick up on that with the panel, but before I shift gears, Thalia, is there anything else that you wanted to share from your perspective?
Not yet. I do have a few things, but I'll hold them for now.
I'm sure, I hope they'll come up through the questions. Then for Alicia and Ali as well, maybe we can pick up on that same topic. In terms of definition of advocacy, I'll start with you, Alicia. Do you have a similar definition? Do you see that differently?
You know, most of the organizations that I've been in, they're either at the very beginning of developing DE&I initiatives. And so I found myself as an advocate by virtue of my position and my titles, and being one of the few women that look like me in those roles. Medical device industries, you know, have notoriously been male dominated for the most part. But being in regulatory, being a Black woman has been something that is sometimes an anomaly. And so advocacy for me is simply being who I am, displaying who I am, and leveraging my expertise in my job in such a way that it creates an entry point to those discussions, especially when there are areas of conflict or challenges, and being available at all times, being aware of who I am and bringing that to the conversation at appropriate times. So that those are pretty much for it's not being having to be an advocate in an informal way in order to drive changes and expectations and decisions forward.
Thank you. And Allie, can I pick up on that idea of awareness with you? How do we get, I think we called it a pre-awareness when we were briefing a little bit, you know, maybe I'm socialized a certain way and we're all perpetuating issues without knowing it. How do we develop that awareness for ourselves or others?
Thanks so much, Alana. I was preparing to talk about advocacy in terms of, but it's connected. I really appreciate what Thalia and Alicia have said so far. And to go along with, you know, becoming aware of things that we might not be aware about. What I was going to say in terms of advocacy is attending to all aspects of a person. So I'm thinking a lot about what Alicia said, you know, advocacy for me is being who I am. And Thalia talking about allyship, we can't create genuine allyship and, you know, take meaningful action if we don't attend to all the aspects of ourselves and to all the aspects of those who we're working with. So, you know, as a white person, it's important for me to, you know, attend to those aspects of myself. And for instance, to help other white people attend to and to think about our whiteness in a society where, you know, white supremacy is insidious and it is the default. It behooves us to not think about our whiteness, right? So that's a way to think about, you know, what are my identities and how am I bringing those identities to the table and how are they engaging and interacting with the identities of those who are also at the table? And we could think about this through any of our identities, right? Thinking about gender, how am I bringing my gender identity to the table and how is that perhaps, you know, alienating someone else at the table that I'm not even aware of, being a cisgender person, or, you know, for me as a queer person coming to the table, how is the language that people are using around their sexuality, including me or excluding me? All of that, you know, plays into the role of starting to build awareness that I think.
We often talk about work-life distinction, but as I'm hearing you talk, it sounds like the way we show up at work doesn't allow us to compartmentalize work and life. We're bringing all of that sort of subconscious and background with us. So how do we start those difficult conversations? If I'm sitting here thinking, okay, that, you know, maybe I want to take the leap, but how do I begin? Does anyone have a suggestion on how to do that? Thalia, I see you coming on.
I didn't say it was an easy answer because, you know, as Allie pointed out, it can be difficult bridging or creating the bridge with someone when you're sitting in a meeting and they said something that made you feel alienated or that you couldn't be your authentic self. I don't know if any of you have read the book Subtle Acts of Exclusion by Tiffany Jana, but she has some really powerful examples that we go through, which is day to day, and we don't even think about it. And really having the courage to have the conversation with the individual or individuals who have displayed the behavior is what she recommends in the book. It's and not doing it publicly where they're embarrassed. It's really taking them aside and helping them understand. And that's also one of the strongest ways to build allyship. Is being willing to raise your hand and talk to the person and say, listen, when you made these comments in the meeting, I interpreted them X, and it did sort of make me feel left out or make me feel excluded or whatever the behavior or response was on your behalf, and having a dialogue about it. Many times people just don't understand. And I think that's where you start. Let's seek to understand.
Get the understanding there first. And before I jump back to Alicia, I have a follow-up on that, Thalia, just to be very candid. Okay, I'm putting myself in that position. So would you recommend speaking to that person one-on-one, which would be more, probably they prefer that, but if I speak in the group, then I'm maybe influencing more people. Is there a recommended approach between these trade-offs?
You know, I think it depends on how you feel and how comfortable you think the person would be or receptive, because the receptivity is the critical part to having the dialogue and being able to move the needle, right? So if you're in the group setting and you don't feel that it's the best, the one-to-one, but if you feel that others have felt the same way you do, or others have said they might feel the same way, it's worth a shot, but you know, it's a fine line. You've got to really assess the situation well.
It's not a one-size-fits-all answer.
It
like
is not a
life.
Exactly.
That would be
it's
nice.
not. Unfortunately, it's not.
Question about then. Let's assume we've started having some conversations. We've got some awareness coming into play. How do we know when we've turned the corner on advocacy? Are there some signals that would tell me, okay, I'm making progress? Alicia or Ali, maybe I'll start with one of you. Thanks, Alicia.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it does take, you know, unbeknownst to us, we are constantly, as all leaders do, you're evaluating the landscape. You're looking, you're scanning the landscape for a variety of different things. You're looking for new leaders, you're looking for opportunities. And so I think it's just inherent in leadership to be aware of those subtle changes. For me, it is when I begin to hear authentic conversations, or I hear ownership, or I hear discussions on actual implementation where the idea becomes less esoteric and there are active steps that indicate there's a progression, at least in another person or another organization. And that's when I begin to see or believe that things have turned the corner.
Thank you. Ali, would you care to add anything there?
Sure. Just to build on what's already been said, I really love the question, thinking about, you know, a company taking steps and turning a corner. And I think it's always important, because there are ways to definitely think about, okay, how is advocacy playing out here and becoming stronger? I think it's also important to keep in mind, you know, that we're groups of individuals, and within the company, individuals are shifting in and out. And also as individuals, we could be advocates and not be advocates within the same 10 minutes, right? It all depends on what are we doing moment to moment. So I think, you know, I don't think I have anything to add to the idea of turning the corner, because I love everything that Thalia and Alicia said. I think it's also important to keep in mind, just because collectively a corner is turned, the individual work and awareness has to continue to happen.
Thank you. And for an individual who is maybe meeting some resistance in terms of gaining advocacy, is there any objection handler we can help them with? Thalia, you already mentioned business outcomes, right? It's not just a nice to have or, you know, an extracurricular. This is core to the business. But are there other arguments that people in the audience can make if they're not getting traction?
I think the answer that comes to mind as I anticipate this question, or it's a really good question, and it's not an easy one to answer either. So I'm going to make this one a little personal. I put it in the bucket of, how would I like to be treated? How would I like to be considered? I think Alicia had mentioned earlier, authentically showing up as who she is, and you know, coming from the regulatory science area, she's absolutely correct. She's sometimes, I'm sure, has been the lone wolf in the room as a woman of color. And so does that make her less because she walked into the room as a woman of color and she's a sole woman of color. And I think too many times we focus on that. And you know, I can't tell you this is an easy answer. It's not. It is an individual commitment to saying, I'm going to make a conscious effort. I'm going to be intentional about being inclusive, about being, and even learning where my blind spots are. Because we do this work, we also have these blind spots. I think people always think, well, you're sitting in a D&I chair or you're doing D&I work. And so that is absolutely not true. It's a journey for us every day as well. So, and being transparent and being open to that.
Thank you. Alicia, did you want to add something there?
I agree with Thalia. It is, it's complex. It's ever shifting because, as Ali mentioned, people come and go. So there's organizations are constantly, there's always the need for education, re-education, reminders. And I was thinking about, you know, when you finally get a bolus of people, or you've all gone through that same shared training or awareness or experience, it's nice to have someone who then you can continually give permission to challenge, as Thalia said, your blind spots, because they're varied. I mean, to me, I look at it just like anything else. It's almost like an onion, like you peel one layer and then there's another layer and there's another layer. It's another, it stinks, you're crying, and
Tears, yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So
well, it
great.
reminds me of what they say in advertising, right? It's message repetition, and sometimes we just need to keep hammering the message home, or even in something we can relate to, many of us in real life is when I worked at Gerber in marketing, we learned, they actually scientifically found that you need to try the same food 12 times and let the baby reject it that many times until they would actually like it. So maybe there's something to this, We're about to take some questions in the chat. So I just want to ask you a question, Ali, because you're in an academic environment and you do these workshops. Do you, is there a multiplier effect if you're able to impact and move people individually? Do you see that then they move other people along the spectrum?
Absolutely. We've definitely seen, in terms of allowing for the space and the time for people to reflect on advocacy. I think that's what's been the most impactful for me to see at my institution and in these nonprofit and for-profit companies. We just don't get the time to reflect on ourselves and our identities, to have these conversations, especially for people who aren't as far along in their journey. You know, it could be thought of, well, I don't want to be inappropriate by talking about these, you know. So having the space and time, I have seen, you know, has definitely given people more awareness, and people want to spend more time doing this work and spreading this work to everyone else that they're, you know, working with. This has really, I've seen across, you know, at my institution and for-profit, you know, the for-profit and nonprofit companies, after they do these workshops, they're like, okay, so what's next? What are we continuing to do as a community? Be it, you know, a book club that's not really a book club, where you're actually practicing working on really difficult conversations and talking about situations that you faced that week. And, you know, it might look like creating more committees where, okay, we're thinking about hiring in this way, you know. So long story short, yes, there's definitely a multiplier effect, and it's been exciting to see what. Yes.
Well, it reminds me of sometimes we're working on strategy with clients, and they'll say, oh, we need a no meeting block so we can just think about, you know, strategic topics, or just think about innovation and disruption. So wouldn't it be great to have a block for this topic and advocacy and all about D&I? So let me start taking some questions from the chat and see which of you want to respond to these. And the first one is probably mostly for Thalia, but anyone who can chime in. It was about, whether there's training for male senior leaders to develop their advocacy and allyship for diverse colleagues and women.
So I can speak to the piece around women, and I know my colleagues who are also sitting in leading the other dimensions of diversity are developing allyship programs as well. But yes, we do have a dedicated work stream within BMS and within BNow, actually, for creating what we call creating male allies. And we take it a step further after we've taken them through their 6-week journey of helping them understand the journey of women at the board table and within the corporate environment. We put them in a group where we call it engaging gender advocates. So we actually do put them to work. So yes.
And have you had, would you consider that there's a good level of openness and success there, or is that more of an uphill battle, would you say?
No, it's actually pretty successful. We've so I think someone had asked me how long had this model been in place with BMS, and I think it was you, Alana. You asked me that question. BMS started this journey with the PBRGs back in 2016, and since its inception, we started focusing on and creating male advocates, as we call them, in 2017. Since then, we've trained well over 200 men and senior executives as well. So, and it's always rewarding when they come out of the training to hear them say, wow, because there are those microaggressions and unconscious biases that they're not realizing actually exist in the workplace for women. You know, we always hear, well, you're at so-and-so percentage representation. Why do we still need to talk about this? Because the journey to get there is still quite painful. So we need to talk about this.
That's right. It doesn't have a discrete endpoint, at least right now, right? Yeah. We need to have that as an obsolete topic. And a question for Alicia or Allie. Someone's asking about the various levels of impact you can have as far as you can speak to that individual. Let's say there's an inappropriate or concerning comment at work. Of course, you can speak more publicly on LinkedIn, or you can go to a bigger social media forum. Any perspective on that?
So I think always, one of the things I learned in DE&I was to, before you even become engaged with either a meeting or a discussion, or always consider how are you going to show up and what is the impact you want to have. Okay. So it's always be ready to be able to define that before you have the conversations. Typically, unless it's the first time, you really aren't clear, who you're going to be involved in. So you probably have an idea of what you're walking into. So if it is something where there generally is a large group of people that have not turned the corner in awareness or understanding of their behavior and the impact on others, then there could be the intention to make a statement from from a large perspective. If it's one or two people, and depending on your relationship, sometimes it's best to have that one-on-one conversation, but to always approach it from a perspective of curiosity. As far as, and I find that always, that carries a lot more weight. To be curious about what was that statement? How did that, what did you mean by that? I just really want to explore that a little bit. And then once you seek to understand, then you can be understood.
Asking questions versus jumping in with accusations right away, right? Just stepping back with an openness.
How many of us have been in that situation where we believe somebody had a bias, and maybe from a personal perspective, they didn't, because they've had relationships that we weren't aware of. So it's always best to ask the question first.
Find out more, be curious. Allie, what's your experience in that regard?
Yeah, so I was just looking back at Natasha's question that raised this point in the conversation, and something that I'm thinking about is, thinking about what are you sharing and why. Just a different way to kind of say what Alicia was already saying, but in terms of what you're sharing openly in a setting, no matter where it is, it's important to understand what are you sharing and why are you sharing it. So I guess this is a place where I could talk about an example. Yeah, so I had the opportunity when I was at Duquesne to co-teach with a Black woman graduate student because of the work I had been doing in my research. And we actually already knew each other. It just made sense on a lot of different levels, and we had a really good rapport. But the one day we were teaching, so we were teaching composition, and to teach composition, as I had done with my co-teacher, who was a white woman, a fellow white woman, we were teaching King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And so when I was lesson planning with, my co-teacher, we were doing this planning and she was really quiet. And at some point she started crying during this planning. And I wasn't at that point, unaware of what was going on. Like Alicia said, this idea of curiosity, I wasn't approaching the situation with curiosity. I was approaching it with thinking about the power dynamics of I need to help teach this person to be a better teacher, and I'm the mentor in this case and she's the mentee, so I need to already have it all figured out, including assuming why she was crying instead of asking, right? So the situation played out, and it didn't play out well. It was not a good situation. Class that day did not go well. I was still all up in my feelings and not processing what does, how am I acting like, what is my whiteness doing in this situation? What is my position as a woman doing in this situation? And it wasn't until a few weeks after where, I was able to process what happened and reach out to that person and ask, hey, can we reprocess what happened? Would you do that reprocessing with me? If you don't want to, totally respect that, because I realized I had taken some faults, but this was a moment where the person was very generous with me and we were able to create allyship to discuss, here's what happened. We were teaching this to a class of all white students, and as a Black woman, that could be very uncomfortable. And I wasn't thinking about that because I'm also a white person. So we were able to talk through those dynamics, and we were able to then advocate for each other within our department. It was a predominantly white department, so it allowed me to, talk with her about things that she didn't feel comfortable talking about with anyone else in the department moving forward. All that to say, I share this story here, and I shared this as part of an article that I wrote a few years ago. First of all, it's a personal story that doesn't involve just me. So I checked in with her to say, is it okay for me to share this story? Here's why I want to share this story, to help others learn from it. If she would have said, no, I don't want you to share that story, I would have respected that. So long story short, I think we always have to be thinking about, what are you sharing and why? What is the impact versus, are you doing this intentionally, or is it maybe performative and not necessary and taking up more space than it needs to? And with that, I feel like I'm taking up more space than I should be. So
no, there's a lot in there. In the chat, I already see someone saying they've been in the shoes of that student multiple times, leaning into discomfort. So certainly topics that are resonating. Let me ask a couple of last questions, and maybe we'll do kind of a lightning round. So I'd love to hear from each of you on this, if I can put you on the spot with a couple of questions. The first one is, if you had a kind of a spectrum, oh, I'm getting a note. We have another quick poll that we can do. So let me hold off on the question and just see if folks in the audience, if we can engage you for a moment. To answer a question, because on the one hand, I'm hearing we've come a long way. There's all this progress, but I've also heard a bit of, we have a long way to go. It doesn't stop. there's a feeling that it never ends. It's between the lines, but I hope that it will be obsolete at some point. So if people have a moment to go to menti.com again and use the code at the top of the screen, I'd love to see where this group falls in terms of saying we have a long way to go. That's a bit more of the, not maybe the pessimistic side, but and the realistic side in terms of advocacy, or do you feel we've come a long way? And of course, it's an unfair question because they're both true, but I'd love to see where we fall a little bit more on the spectrum in this audience, just to take a quick read, let's say directionally. We'll give a moment for people to answer, then we'll do our lightning question, and I'll turn it back to Kayla for our close. So you can see it's moving a little bit, but it's interesting. We're hanging out a little bit in that middle-ish area. Excellent, thank you. And do we have more answers coming in, or should we close the poll? I don't have a sense of how many responses are in. All right, looks like we can close, but you can see it's shifting. It's getting a little bit more to the left. So, and it's both. This was really meant to more thought starter and wrap up. Then, of course, there's no right answer here because we have come a long way, but we also have a long way to go. Then let me please turn back to the panel and ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Thalia. What is one action that people in the audience can take away that you can recommend that they can implement relatively right away?
Be curious, embrace, really be open to curiosity, ask questions, and open to learning.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Alicia, what's your word of advice for someone to get started and take action?
So I've learned this recently, as Thalia mentioned. I think the biggest impact we can all have is to be willing to share our stories. One, they're our stories, so they're difficult to be contended with. And everybody, we all are connected in some way. So it's going to resonate with someone. So that's my biggest thing, because that's personal. It's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Other people are listening.
It's something we can all do. I can do that tomorrow when in one of my meetings, let's say. And Dr. Resnick, what would you advise to this wonderful audience?
I would say two things. Have courage. And also, to have courage to do this kind of work, you have to make sure you're taking care of yourself. And this might be just the simple thing that I make everyone do before I start any class or any workshop, is to take 5 breaths and ground yourself and understand where you are and what you're bringing to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of that pause that you took in the story you shared. Thank you for sharing that, right? Anytime something gets to be emotional, it's usually good to take a pause and come back to it. Say, let's revisit. Well, I cannot thank this group enough for all the information, ideas that were shared. We've got a lot of great feedback in the chat, and I really want to thank you again for your participation and wisdom, and turn it back to Kayla for any closing comments.
Thank you so much, Alana. And I want to thank all our speakers for today's event. We had some really great conversation. I think a lot of insights and takeaways that we can take back for both our personal and professional lives. So we'll have a little bit of a survey at the end of this this program. I encourage you to please fill out the couple questions that we'll have going forward, so we can get your feedback and insight. And then I'd like to also just again thank our sponsor PNC Bank for supporting our diversity and inclusion activities. And Women in Bio puts on our national webinars every month. And I also want to give a plug for the West Coast chapters, who will be hosting a collaborative event across SoCal, San Francisco, and Seattle tomorrow. Please check that out. It'll continue the conversation of diversity and inclusion from there with their programming. So I look forward to tuning into that as well tomorrow. And again, just a round of applause for all our speakers today. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.